I guess we're live. Okay, go ahead. Yes, I'm sorry about that. As you were saying.
Oh, I think you just, let's see, you mentioned that it must be weird to have Growing Up Dead, to get feedback about it. Now it's been however long it's been. I think you said it came out in
Almost 20
2009, right?
years, 2009, right?
Yeah,
2010.
yeah.
Yeah,
So, honestly, it's really cool. And so I saw Oteil and Friends
sure.
on Sunday, and it was a great show and all this stuff. But every time I go to a show like that, especially if it's local, where people sort of associate me with that more like visually,
Hmm.
um, somebody has something to say, and they appreciate it and they're glad and they're enjoyed it or whatever it might be. And I mean, that's amazing. As an artist and as a writer, to have created something that is still reaching people, that still connects with people, and I think to me, most importantly, sort of conveys messages that I want to share, about the scene and about,
Oh yeah.
what's going on there and what can be sort of mined out of it and where the value is in my eyes, and point some directions maybe for future readers and so forth. So and obviously, the scene has continues to grow and pull in new people and all that stuff. So to me, it's like, so I know for a fact that that book has turned some people on and got them started to go to shows, and or maybe they've seen one or two and then they get the book and they go like, oh my gosh, there's all this other stuff. So yeah, it's amazing, and I feel really grateful that it's still out there and reaching people. And I mean, artistically, it's really satisfying to have created it.
Yeah. And I gotta say, you do such an awesome job, even with your writing style, where it's stream of consciousness, kind of like it almost feels like you need to come up for a breath of air while you're while you're writing, like you're trying to get so much out and there's so many details, and every detail is like dripping really with word with meaning and love, and you really get that sense reading the book that this is something that's really truly authentic. And I think that if it was done more organized or more linear, hypothetically, or more whatever, formal structure, that it would lose a lot of the heart. And I think that, I mean, again, we spoke before I read the book, and then I read the book in the week in between, and a couple of days in between, and it took me a day and a half to finish. I couldn't put it down, and I felt like I was there with you, and I felt like this guy gets what I've been feeling, and I know that that's got to be something that's part of the magic of it. That's a beautiful continuation of the magic of the scene, is that it's recognizable instantly, whether you've been there or not.
Yeah, and I'll give credit to my editor, Ben Schaefer at Capo Press too, who acquired the book and who I worked with, and who, while not, certainly has a great appreciation for the Grateful Dead, but for tons of music too,
Hmm.
but understands it, in a way that he um, gave permission, understanding that I was sort of speaking to peers in that scene. And I think he was really, kind of like, let it rip, go for it, whatever's going to work. And so things like that, there's sections in there that are told in the second person and they're on italics, right? So instead of saying,
Hmm.
I did this or I did that, then it's you wake up in
Yeah,
the morning, you're in the
which I
band, you're
loved.
this, that. Yeah. And that allowed me, so I come from a poetry background and I run a poetry publishing house now. And, poetry is sort of my first language in a lot of
Mhm.
ways. So that those sections in particular allowed me to bring a lot of poetry into the book in a way that I wouldn't have done if I was speaking in the first person the whole time. It gave
Hmm.
enough distance to be able to get really poetic with the language and with the scene, step outside of it a little bit. And I think that is really what made the book. I think the whole book told like that probably would have gotten a little old, and the whole book told in first person wouldn't have gotten where I wanted to go. So it was really the combination. And if you don't have an editor who's willing to go there with you, then
Yeah,
you can't really make the trip yourself. So I'm grateful to him as well.
yeah. It's so much fun because uh, you it's a diary, but it's clearly so much more, and it's clearly written from a more contemplative, mature place. But with a lot of the visions, really obviously very vivid and very bright. Um, it's it's really awesome. I went to, I guess the closest thing that I've ever gone to was a J-Rad show, a couple of J-Rad shows, and I love them. They were actually my introduction into the Dead scene. I don't know if I mentioned that to you, but and I was over the moon when I got to talk to Tom Hamilton, who's that lead player. And I was just like, dude, you are the man, man. and you know, and I was talking to people at the concert, you know, these guys that have been there forever and gone to the Dead shows back in the 70s, 80s, 90s. And and I think this was after I've been following the band for a long time. And when I follow bands, I do like to do deep dives. Like I know every Springsteen set list, you know, from every tour because like I know which songs he added on and which songs he kept in. And I came at the Dead with that similar type of obsessiveness where I'm like, okay, this is a 70s set list, this is a 77 set list. And you could differentiate, you know, pretty quickly, obviously, especially with all the lore that's out there. And then someone is like, dude, you don't even know the half of it. The parking lot, the drive to the concert, you know, like after the show's over, like they're like, you don't even know, you don't even like, you're just missing dimensions of this. So maybe you could fill in anyone that might be a Grateful Dead music fan but might be missing out a little bit on the details of the scene, what that was kind of like a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the first and most important thing with the Grateful Dead is always the music, So you came in appropriately enough with the music, they grabbed you. And there's a whole, let me go back in my time machine and say, the whole touring scene around the Grateful Dead kind of grew up in the 80s more. And even in the 70s, there were people who were going to, a bunch of shows, don't get me wrong. But the whole idea of, a bunch of people touring and vending and having all that set up and
Yeah.
being able to sell grilled cheese or whatever and to make it go, that really sort of developed in the 80s. And that was really my time. So I was fortunate to come into a situation where, I was completely captivated by this music when I was about 15 before I'd seen them and was fascinated by it. And as somebody who loved language always and loved reading, I was really taken with the lyrics as well. And the music was very, I was the youngest, I am the youngest of four. And I grew up in the 70s and I could, recite lyrics to every Boston, REO Speedwagon, Kansas. I mean, all that music was like embedded in me. And the lyrics were a huge part of it. And I just always remembered them and I could spit them back and entertain my brother's older friends who I wanted to think I was cool and all that stuff.
Hmm.
When I encountered the Grateful Dead, I had all that in me, but they were so different than anything that I had heard. And I hadn't really been acquainted with poetry. And so to see, to encounter this language that was used so poetically, and then this music that was so different than what I had experienced, I was completely captivated by it. And so that was the first thing. And then I went to my first show and saw that scene around it, and just pulling into the parking lot. And I really, this is kind of the second person sections of that book, right? You pull into
Hmm.
the parking lot and the sights, the smells, the sounds, the people. I had never seen anything like that. I was from a suburb of Rochester, New York, and that's where I grew up and that's where I spent my time, So it was like, I didn't even know all of this stuff was there, but I absolutely fell in love with it immediately and wanted to like experience as much of that as I could. And so that's what I did. And so yeah, you can go around and you can see, bits and pieces of that and different iterations at different, festivals and at different some bands, still pull that sort of energy and pull those followers and things
Hmm.
like that. The bottom line is each era is going to have its own feel though. So even though you have, people tour, like you have bands that have nothing to do with the Grateful Dead and they call that strip Shakedown Street where you can go and buy things. Not well, obviously that's a Grateful Dead thing, but now it's transcended. So that in its own way has nothing to do with the Grateful Dead when you put it in with Fish or whoever the band is, and you go, I'm going to Shakedown Street. Like, okay, now it's its own thing, and that's
Hmm.
super cool. And a lot of those aspects have translated into other bands and other festival scenes and so forth. But it's always going to have its own feel of that era. Do you know what
Hmm.
I mean? And so, and of course, people get, attached to their era, right? Whatever their
Sure.
heyday is like, that's the thing. And that's a funny thing about all of these bands, and the Grateful Dead especially. You could have gone to a show in 1973 and been told by some hippie that you missed all the good stuff because the good stuff was in the 60s,
Sure.
and you could have gone to a show in 79 and it's like, oh, 72 is really where it's at. Like, there's always somebody who's like, it was better before, you're
Hmm.
catching this, but it's not, which I think is, it's funny. I mean, it's really, it's bullshit because it's like, what am I supposed to do with that? You know what I mean? I don't have a
Yeah.
time machine, and I'm enjoying what's going on now. So let's just talk about this, But that's every seed, right? That's just how people are. So I think that there's so much cool stuff going on right now with J Rad, or what, seeing OTL as I just did on
Yeah.
Sunday, seeing all these different incredible musicians interpreting the music of the Grateful Dead,
Uh-huh.
in a way that, I equate it to jazz musicians have something called the real book. And the real book is essentially like, if you're a real serious jazz musician, like, you probably know every song in there.
Sure.
When you sit down to play with other jazz musicians, they can pick any song from the real book and you're going to know this. And that's it. And so it's essentially jazz standards. And I
Hmm.
think in its own way, the Grateful Dead's songbook is becoming its own real book for more sort of jam, exploratory rock music. And
Sure.
so you have somebody like J-Rad playing that music, and it sounds totally different than I just heard what O'Teal was doing.
Hmm.
It's all the Grateful Dead, but it's completely different. J-Rad
Yeah.
has a much heavier edge than I'd ever heard anybody approaching that songbook. And so they're making it their own. In my, to my ears, that's how they're really defining themselves, is they're playing all this music, but they have a real sort of edge to it. And it's a
Yeah.
little, it's not metal, but I mean,
They
they
do
go
they do
there.
they do that on purpose. They do that
Yeah,
on
well, I'm
purpose,
sure.
and
Yeah,
they say that. And I think Dark Star Orchestra is the band that tends to try to stay as close, like very very close to true to form, right? And like
right.
play the famous sets through and whatever. And I've heard Tom describe that, at least say that the other members of the, like, they're like, listen, we could do this the same way as everyone else, but then you could go see everyone else, and
Yeah.
China Cat doesn't always have to come before I Know You Rider, and Scarlet Begonia doesn't always have to follow Fire of the Mountain, and and so on.
Right. And that's part of the fun, to
Yeah.
hear those things mixed up. But that's exactly what I'm saying is like those guys and J-Rad, or the guys playing with O'Teal, or all these different, the guys in Dark Star Orchestra, these are master musicians. So
Mm-hmm.
they could take anything. I'm convinced they can take anything and they can play it however they want. They could play it in a samba if they wanted to. They could play bossa nova if they wanted to. This is what they're choosing to do. And that to me is the beauty of that songbook, the flexibility of
Yes.
those songs to be able to be interpreted with this almost like metal edge to it, or taking a set list, and as the Grateful Dead would have done it, which over
Mm-hmm.
the years those things switched too. What goes in the first set, what goes in the second set. When we play this song, now we're not going to play this song for 8 years, whatever it might be. But it's really fun as a older dead to go and see like that sort of mixed up and swirled together and put out in this way. So I have a deep appreciation for that, and I think it goes so far beyond the concept of a cover band. These are
Mm-hmm.
not cover
Sure.
bands. These are just bands that are interpreting that songbook in their own way, and there's a big difference with
Yeah,
that.
sure. Yeah, exactly. They're agreeing to the same basic parameters, but everything that's between minute, other than maybe the chorus and a couple of the keys, the key of the song that you're in, everything
Right.
else is kind of up in the air, and you can do whatever you want with it. And certainly, I'm a very amateur, campfire guitar player from listening to the Dead, of course, and I got to figure out a way between Springsteen, Dylan, and the Dead to put to create the lyrics myself and to create the music myself a little bit. And they're very, and I also enjoyed this part of your book. They're very accessible to play even as a beginner. And you can be a Deadhead and be a fan forever and appreciate the intricacy of the music. And then if you want to pick up a guitar, it's 3 or 4 chords, and you're okay, and you can and you can give yourself that feeling of like, I just play that same song as they did, and there might be a universe of a difference again, but I'm part of this now, and it kind of, it it invites, it's very inviting. It's a very inviting tradition that says, you know, you can play this as fancy as you want and you can be these masters of musicians, but you could also be a dude in a college dorm room or a 25-year-old picking up a guitar for the first time after a midlife crisis or quarter life, you hope, and saying that, you know, and saying, I'm going to learn a couple of songs and realizing you could actually do it. And I think it's amazing.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Yeah,
Uh,
it's really cool. And I think that's what's pulling in, the new generations of fans and listeners. They weren't even born. I mean, not for nothing, but when were you born? What year were you born at?
95, December 95, almost
Okay, so
96.
you were, yeah, like you were not even alive when Jerry was
Yeah.
alive, which is crazy to think about. But how cool is that? I mean, that to me is, again, it is a tribute to this songbook, and
Hmm.
it's its own great American songbook in its way. And I think this is what's gonna have this music lasting. And so that means for people who are the older school deadheads, they need to not be as precious with it and to let it go some, and
Yeah.
not have that, like, well, it was better and you didn't know and you didn't see and you did, like, no, no, it's not about that. You know what I mean? It
Yeah.
really isn't. It's about this music. And if you love this music, you want to see it survive. And personally, I'm fascinated watching all the different interpretations of it. I love
Hmm.
Dead and Company. I went and saw them a whole bunch of times for their, the whole time that they were playing, including like 9 Sphere shows, at the end there and all this stuff. And um, I love that too. And it
Yeah.
was probably the closest energetically to the old, Dead shows
How was the
back in the
Sphere
day.
shows? Can you tell me about the Sphere shows?
Oh yeah, they're insane. Yeah, they were
Because I've
completely.
been
I
to the
mean,
Sphere, but not for a concert.
yeah, no, they were amazing. It's different in that, the visuals are so connected with the experience. So
Hmm.
I have to remember, if I'm going back and I'm listening to some of these old Sphere shows, which I do and I enjoy them, they played slightly differently because of the visuals. So
Hmm.
some jams might have been extended in a way that maybe things weren't really clicking with that jam like that. But there's visuals on screen and there's a timing
Yes.
issue and all these things. So it's really a 360-degree experience that was custom made for that music. So it's amazing that right at the end there, all of that came together, because what it really is, in my mind, it's a throwback to the acid tests. And
Hmm.
when the Grateful Dead started out and playing the acid tests, it wasn't just like, we're going to go see a concert and here's this band. They would say themselves,
Right.
like, we were just one of the things that was happening. There was also a guy jamming on kazoo, and there was somebody throwing paint against the wall, and there's somebody freaking out over here, and this and that. So it was this full experience that the Grateful Dead were a part of, and that's what gave them part of the permission and freedom to be so experimental. Now, a big part of that became a visual trip, so whether it was
Sure.
showing movies that Ken Kesey had shot in the bus, or doing the old, having an overhead projector and taking colored
Hmm.
liquid and smearing it around so you have these globs and all this stuff, like that was a part of that original experience too. So now you fast forward to the end of that sort of era, right, when Bob Weir's last hurrah here, and you have this blown up to a proportion that nobody could have foreseen.
Yeah.
The magnitude of that is incredible. So I felt like we were on a continuum, and this was the natural extension of that continuum, taken as far as it could. And good for them for doing that. It's a really, really cool experience. I hope I can go back sometime and see that music again there, but it's not going to have Bobby with it. But I don't know.
Yeah. It's gonna
I
be,
hope,
it's
I hope
gonna
it
be
happens.
heartbreaking.
Yeah.
It's sad. It's really sad. And I mean, I think that John Mayer gets a lot of flack. I don't know why. Maybe it's just my Twitter algorithm that says that. But I think that he's been remarkably eloquent and respectful in a really, really interesting way of the whole culture. And he's been in it for over a decade now. So like, and this, and it's funny because I did want to bring up to you your relationship, your perspective, I guess, or your relationship with Brent, because
Mm.
it's funny as someone that just picked this up a couple of years ago. I'm like, well, Brent's one of the later guys, like he's one of the, and to me it should all be the same. I mean, he was with the band as long as any other keyboard player has, but there's this like kind of club, it feels like, that like if you're not that original San Francisco crew over there, then no matter how long, it could literally be decades, and like you're kind of not part of the old boys.
Yeah. I would say for the most part, and this, and I'll put John Mayer, the whole John Mayer discussion in the mix there. People are just they get locked into their own trip. It
Uh-huh.
was best when it was my heyday. Well, you were in your 20s, you had no responsibilities, you were traveling around, you were dropping acid, you had a ball. Like, that's awesome, good for you. But guess what? It was really cool before then, it was really cool after that. Interesting things happen here and there. So people get just locked into their own trip with that. And I think, I have nothing but respect for John Mayer. And I
He's
don't
been
really
amazing.
have time to hear people bag on, the music or the players or whatever. Like, give me a fucking break. Do you know how good this guy is? I
And
mean,
he's
do you
out of this
know the
world.
talent just dripping off of this guy effortlessly? And it didn't just happen. He put in the fucking hours. The guy
Uh-huh.
worked his ass off. You know what I mean? So, but I'm going to bag him as one artist to another. I'm going to say he's not good. Give me a fucking break. This guy is like beyond good. You know what I mean? But Bob Weir wasn't going to play with somebody who sucks for 10 years. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Let's have some respect for his judgment. You know what I mean? He saw
sure.
what Mayer was doing. And I think more importantly, he saw what Mayer was capable of. And
Hmm.
Mayer grew into that role over the years. I think he came to it. He discovered the Grateful Dead. He was a fan, but he really comes from more of a blues background, probably
Yeah,
some jazz sprinkled in there. That's his background, and pop. He's
yeah,
a pop musician as well. But that's where he came from. But as a guitar player, he's very, very blues based at his
yeah.
core. So when Dead and Company started playing those songs, his solos tended to be a little blockier. They were a little bluesier, they were a little bit more cut and dry, not as experimental. And over the years, he
Hmm.
adapted and he grew into this role when by the end, he was, completely, let's say, fluent in the language of the Grateful Dead.
Yeah,
And you
yeah.
could really look at it like that. You take somebody in their first year French, and then you take them 10 years later after they've been immersed in French and living in France and all this stuff, like they're going to sound differently. That's John Mayer's trick.
Yeah.
He started out and he learned this language and he became extremely fluent, and then he made it his own. So he
He
took
even made the
songs
certain
like
songs his own.
Sugary. He did things
Uh-huh.
with Sugary that were mind blowing. That he took
Yeah.
Sugary places that, I'm sorry, all due respect to Jerry, love him to death, always my first love. But John, for whatever reason, turned Sugary into a jam vehicle in a way that the Dead hadn't. And
Yeah.
it's really cool that he picked some songs like that to do that with, and
Hmm.
really blow them wide open. But again, those tended to be sort of coming from a more blues based vocabulary that was, his first language, let's say. And then boom, he blew it out there. And I think again, had permission, to do that. And probably, I mean, for a guy who comes from a real pop scene, how amazing to be surrounded now with an audience that's like, fucking go out there, do it, fall on your face if you need to. We'd rather see you take a chance and fall on your face than play it exactly like it is on Room for Squares.
Yep.
You know what I mean? So like, and I think he had a deep appreciation for the Grateful Dead, and then I think it just became a part of him by the end. And I feel like he's completely genuine with that.
I believe that
He's
too.
savvy as hell. I think he's a really smart business person. I don't take any of that stuff away from him. That's a whole other discussion. A lot of guys are who, you don't want to think they are, but they are. But that doesn't take away from what he's doing musically, which I think is absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah, you put it so perfectly. And it's funny because you would imagine that like a blues a blues based player and a player that like John Mayer would be welcome because it really gives them a lot of access to a lot of great songs aside from the songs that he like you say put his own impression on and like when you're listening to different eras and you saw a song in the set list, you'd know who was singing it, you know who was playing it. And John Mayer too, you see Althea, you see Sugary, you see like like you said, these songs he definitely made them his own. And I would imagine that was probably if if I was playing with him and I was the band and I'd be like, these are some really nostalgic songs that we could really throw back to. And you have Pigpen's whole blues book that was just so much fun. Those early the 69, 70 concerts were just crazy with like these. And then I'd look up these songs after and I'd find a gold mine worth of incredible other musicians and blues-based musicians. So it really, the whole thing helps open up your entire musical world and musical vocabulary in just such a unique way. It's really awesome.
Yeah, and you know, to say Brent also was very much kind of had that blues man energy to his playing, and
Hmm.
his voice is just so bluesy and you know, rich and resonant and got edge to it. But you know, he was coming sort of from a blues background as well. And again, we're talking about master musicians who could play anything that they want, but that was energetically, I think, where he was coming from.
Yeah, definitely. I want to touch a couple of, we're gonna bounce a little bit from the dead for a couple of topics, um, if you don't mind. But I mean, I sent you a clip that I'm not sure if you got a chance to see or not, but and then right before I started your book after like maybe, 2 or 3 chapters. I sent you this clip that I thought of that I did an interview with a gentleman named Stephen Kinzer who just testified about MK Ultra in front of Congress. And and then when I saw that, not only had you known what I'd sent you, but you'd elaborated on like deep deep history that only recently became popular. Like, like you're writing about this probably 10, 15 years before the name MK Ultra was really in the zeitgeist, or that people really knew that the CIA had purchased the world's supply of LSD and was handing it out to people like Allen Ginsberg. Uh, how did you, are you a voracious history reader, or how did you come across this information? And you know this has to be some kind of indication of the way, like this kind of knowledge you only come across if you're curious. It's not, this doesn't fall into your lap.
Right. So one of my books is called White Hand Society, The Psychedelic Partnership of Timothy Leary and Allen Ginsberg.
Okay.
And it is about, you know, the psychedelic revolution. This is going back to, I don't know if you know the name Timothy Leary, but he was sort
Hmm,
of like
sure.
an acid guru guy eventually. Started out as a Harvard psychologist, you know, professor, and liked his scotch and things like this, and connected with a very famous poet named Allen Ginsberg, a sort of an underground figure who knew everybody. He'd been around
Hmm.
since the 50s and was highly respected in that scene, and knew everyone. So he connected with Leary when Leary had started to do psychedelic experiments, and then basically just started introducing him to all these artists and underground figures and stuff like that, and really got Leary from being this sort of a more straight laced Harvard psychologist who had an interest in this to somebody who became like this counterculture figurehead, you know?
Hmm.
So that's what the book is about. And obviously, in writing a book like that, you have to know the history of LSD and where it came from, and sort of how it made its way into our culture.
Hmm.
And, you know, starting with the experiments, the bicycle day experiments
Yes.
of, you know, Albert Hoffman
Dr.
and,
Hoffman. Yeah.
yeah, Dr. Hoffman and Sandoz. So yeah, so there's different prongs of the history of psychedelics in this country, and that's one of them. And Leary was a little bit more disconnected from that whole CIA trip, you know,
Yeah.
like experiments. But Kesey directly was a part of that. You know, he got
Sure.
pulled in as a student at Stanford to, excuse me,
Harvard.
no, Ken Kesey was in Oregon.
Oh, was he?
But when he took those, I think he was yeah, he was a student at Stanford in the writing program when he first took LSD. And so he was a part of these experiments, and he was paid to take it, and they just
Hmm.
stuck you in a room and all this stuff like that. But of course, then it came out later what was really going on with MK Ultra, and what the goal was of course to weaponize, you know, LSD and to use it against our enemies and to dose them and see what could happen with that. You know, can we
Yeah,
get them
create a
to break?
Manchurian candidate.
Yeah, can we put it in the water supply? Can we make people, is it a truth serum? Is it a this? Is it a, you know? So that was one strand of that. But then you had psychologists who were doing really legitimate experiments with this for to reduce recidivism, which was one of
Hmm.
Leary's thing of people going back to prison. Can we reduce the rate of people coming out of prison and going back into prison? This revolving door. Can LSD somehow help with that? You know, it's not spoken about, but it was really a part of the early Alcoholics Anonymous as well.
Sure.
Bill W. was an advocate for LSD, used it and wrote about that, and it sort of made its way out of AA lore because it's complicated. You know what I mean? It complicates things in a way that isn't useful for recovering alcoholics, but that is a part of it. So there were all these, people were trying to figure out both above board and below board, what do we do with this extremely powerful drug? And then, of course, in that, you go back to, well, what is the history, not just of LSD, which is a chemical compound, but hallucinogens in general, right? So then we
Hmm.
have to go back to ayahuasca, we have to go
Sure.
back to peyote, we have mushrooms, we have all these different things. And psychedelics in one form or another have been used since
Thousands of years.
mankind, yeah,
Yeah.
first since
Yeah.
since we've been around, kicking around here. So it's a really interesting thing, but unfortunately, out of all that, and I think out of fear and all the different things that happened, then it got made illegal, and then it was like all these penalties. And now by the time you have somebody like me coming through in the 80s and doing acid and going to Grateful Dead shows and stuff like that, you had people doing serious prison time for
Yeah.
a sheet of acid, because what they would do is they would take the paper that the acid was on. So people who don't know, there's a thing called a sheet. It has 100 hits on it. Each hit is one hit of each little piece of paper is one hit of acid. So if you got busted with a sheet of acid back then, I'm sure
It's
still
a,
now,
it's enough. It's 100 trips. It's
they
a lot of
well they
acid.
what they would do is they would weigh it, and
Oh,
you would be punished per the weight of that. Most of that weight
whoa.
was paper.
Yeah.
So there was all sorts of bullshit going on, and but so you take something that's been used for all of humankind, and now you criminalize it and you put people in prison for it and all this stuff. So it's complicated, but there's so much, and now we're at a time where it's starting to come back, and
Yeah.
especially there's really cool experiments going on for PTSD and all
Hmm.
sorts of different ways that now real scientists are able to use this again and to do experiments and to see different applications, to try different applications of these substances, which have great value, and it's not some demon thing, it's anything can be used and misused.
Sure.
So I think there's a ton of potential there, but MK Ultra is a dark chapter of that, because it was essentially, it was just an attempt to weaponize this stuff that is not the best for weaponizing.
Yeah, and it ultimately, I mean, allegedly ultimately failed. The truth is that so much of the documentation was destroyed that we don't know. But from what we found of it, the doctor that was running it, Sidney Gottlieb, said that as of right now, there is no universal method of just like blanket creating a Manchurian candidate. And I mean, the experiments that they did were just off the wall bonkers. But at the end of the
Yeah,
day, yeah, I do say personally that the top three experiences of my life, probably that I've had in the last, probably my life, is it being a father, being a husband, and taking my first acid trip. And
yeah,
I just what happened. I'm in Austin, Texas, and I go to a country rock bar, and I don't know anything about psychedelics. I don't know anything about the dead. I don't know anything about any kind of counterculture. I'm just a dude that is in the middle of COVID and trying to hear some live music. And then my friend who's been telling me that there's a huge stigma to psychedelics the whole time, happened to bring some along the way. And I just like I fell in love with the world. It was so incredible. And we're at this club playing Southern country jam rock music, and people are there till 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, and people are square dancing in the middle, and people are playing pool on the side, and the lights and I remember looking at my phone for the first time in years, being like, I have no use for this thing whatsoever, and I can't believe how much I've been missing out on, like how beautiful this world is. And I was like, this is just like I don't know what this I didn't get any other story I've ever heard in my life before that. Since that experience, I'm like, I have no idea what is true or not. It's incredible.
yeah, yeah. That's cool. Yeah, it's it's powerful stuff, and I think So, one of the things that they were doing that was really shitty is just like dosing people who didn't know they're being dosed,
Yeah.
and
But the dead did that
that's
too.
that's never, yeah, yeah, they did. And it's, that, so there were sort of two schools coming out of the early psychedelic scene, and the dead and the pranksters were one. And I think, that was sort of this like the acid test concept of like, let's just get like as loaded as we can on acid. And not that it didn't have a spiritual component, but it was more like, let's just see how far we can take our brains, and our minds and our experience. And so it was kind of like a freak out scene, and can you like take this heroic dose and still function and do all this stuff? But then there was the Leary side that was more of an East Coast vibe that was
Hmm.
more about how do we take this and go inside and deal with some psychological things. And they were big on, they would say set and setting. Those are the two big
Yes,
things,
sure.
right? So the set was your mindset, and the setting was the environment you were doing it in. And so they took that real seriously, and they would, have candles, and they'd have the right music, and they have all this different stuff, and try and make that trip into something that would touch you, emotionally, spiritual, psychologically, and all these different things, and not just like, we're going to just freak you the hell out. So there was a famous meeting of the pranksters going to Millbrook, the Millbrook estate that Leary and all these people were at. And this is like
Mhm.
a big coming together of the West Coast and the East Coast acid heads. And they were really coming from different places with it. And in a lot of ways, the meeting was kind of it didn't go well. It was kind of it kind of was bunk, because they were like, who are these uptight guys sitting here on pillows, so prim and proper to their thinking. And, the pranksters are driving up Millbrook's driveway, throwing colored smoke bombs out the window and blasting music and all this stuff. And, that was their thing. But again, on that bus was also Allen Ginsberg,
Hmm.
who was one of the reasons he was at the center of my book, is that I call him I don't know if you know the movie Forrest Gump, but he was kind of the
Sure.
Forrest Gump of the counterculture. In Forrest Gump, he's like, he pops up here and he pops up there, all these key
Yeah.
points. That's kind of how Allen Ginsberg was. Of course, he was there at the meeting of the West Coast and the East Coast acid heads because he was Allen Ginsberg, and he was at everything that majorly happened, had him as a part of it, including the
Sure.
first acid tests and things like that. So that to me, I think, to answer your question, is, you know, that is my American history.
Right.
So like when
By the
I
way, me
think
too.
about,
That's the way I feel about it now. It's crazy.
yeah, when I think about the fabric of this country and
Yes.
where it comes from, and we talk about things like freedom and, bravery and, all these, can do and dedicate, whatever it might be, the values that I look at this country and I say, these are the things that I was raised to believe are important. These are the things to me that we should aspire to, on
Yeah.
a national scale. Those are my heroes. Those are my
Hmm.
founding fathers there. So I am interested, and when much like you, if I take an interest in something like that, then I'm going to dive real deep into it and try and understand it, because there's so much to learn there. That's not
Yeah.
taught in school.
Yeah.
And
So
and that's why
that's
I
the
got
best
sucked
stuff.
into the Grateful Dead scene. It's like I was not a good student in school. I
Right.
was a terrible student for all sorts of reasons. But when it came to this stuff, I was like, boom, this, and that's where I got my education. And I just
Yes.
had to find it. So a lot of those people in the Grateful Dead scene, when I got in, there were still guys from the 60s kicking around in the scene and going show to show. Like I listened to those people and I would put myself at their feet. And then, these were not, I mean, they were like, they could be edgy, they could be dodgy. They were, there were all sorts of things because they were just road dogs, but they had a lot of good information and interesting things to say that was completely new to me. And so that's where my education started. And it led me to things, as you said, like now all of a sudden I'm listening to these blues musicians that I'd never heard of before. Now, who are they and where are they coming from? You
Yeah.
know, who like, Bob Weir would say, I want to play guitar like McCoy Tyner's like left hand. Like, well, who is that? And what does that mean? And what, so if you're interested and you want to chase these things down, you go like, okay, what does that mean? Who is this? Now I'm hearing this. And then it goes to the next thing. And with the Grateful Dead, that includes literature, that includes visual art, that
Hmm.
includes all sort of different styles of music. It includes film. It includes all of these different, aspects that to me, that is, again, that's the education that I pursued and that I take real seriously.
Yeah. I listen, I think I actually believe pretty strongly that we're heading towards more of a time where that's going to be the kind of way that people learn in general. Because as as technology is progressing in the way that it is, particularly with AI, and a lot of people, I think, are going to have to. I think that education is probably going to become a lot more individualized, and I think that we've known for a long time that it's probably better that way, and for some reason this system has never really adapted or reformed in any kind of way. But I don't know how much more could be held back. These floodgates are about to open up where kids can have access, and they already have it, to being able to do deep dives on anything they want and really be able to figure out and learn anything that you want. You could start a business. You could become. I started learning piano, just translating over whatever I know from guitar to piano. I've always loved the piano. I had to wait 20 years of my life in order to be able to come back to it and learn it and like and I totally accept that this is the process that I've and my journey and my storyline. But it's so exciting because I think that there is so much available. I know that people are really concerned about students or kids using AI as a substitute for their brain, but I think that if you use it as a companion to follow your interests and follow your curiosities and your passions, you can get a very, very in-depth education very quickly in today's world. And like, I don't know why I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old right now, and I hope to have a bigger family. And I can't imagine sending them to. I teach high school English. I've been teaching it for the last 4 years. I can't imagine sending my kid to one of those schools and thinking that to be better off and more prepared for what the world's going to be. And I think similarly, especially if you weren't necessarily good at school to begin with, you had to show yourself that there was an avenue that you could succeed at and that you could live a successful full life in. And it's really totally fine. And not only that, it's probably better. I mean, it's great.
Yeah, yeah. I think, and I love that you're an English teacher. I actually have a master's in education, and that was the path that I was going down for a long time. And then I got into publishing, and so I've done that my whole career now. But I really love teaching. I have nothing but respect for that. And when I went to school, through high school and elementary and all that different stuff, we had systems where you would just get tracked into a certain track, right? So
We
if
had
you
that too.
were, right? So if you were like, so for me, if I went back eventually and I looked at all my standardized test scores from when I was young and stuff like that, and I would be in sixth grade reading it, 12 plus grade level and doing math at like a second grade level.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
the textbook definition of a learning disability. When you look at it, that's now people to go, oh, that's what that is. But then it was like, well, if you do math this way, it doesn't matter how good you can do this, you're in this track. So
Hmm.
I had been tracked into this sort of level that it was like I wasn't, in some ways, like I didn't know what was going on. In other ways, I wasn't challenged at all. And
Hmm.
either way, what was being communicated was essentially like, you're not really smart, you're not, whatever it might be. And I did accept that. And then I didn't want to accept that anymore. You know what I mean? It didn't feel right to me because I knew how much I loved writing and reading always.
Hmm.
And so again, to be able to sort of set that aside, and I think through the use also of psychedelics, it allowed me to
Yes.
break that mindset of like there's one way to look at things, and here it is. And if you're not fitting into this mold, then you're kind of a lost cause. Good luck with the next 75 years. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
You kind of suck. And it's like, well, no. Actually,
Yeah.
let's blow that shit right up, and go like, there's all sorts of different ways to look at things. There's also, there's creativity, there's all these different, and now we sort of take these things for granted. There's so many wonderful accommodations made, in so many places for students who have different ways of learning. And we look at things like Gardner's multiple intelligences and all this different stuff that has started out in one way, and I'm sure it's evolved in ways that I have no idea about with education. But the core of that understanding that each individual has their own processes and their own strengths and weaknesses and stuff like that, and how do you work with them? Like that wasn't really a thing, in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
You sort of like, if you were screwed up, they would just like stick you into shop class, and you'd be like working on cars or whatever. It was like, oh, let's put them all over there. So I think in a lot of ways, that sort of thing saved me. This stuff saved me, and it saved my own faith in myself, and
Hmm.
allowed me to learn and discover new ways of being able to express what I had inside of me and have it validated by this
Yeah.
community that went, we value creativity above all. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
That's our main thing. Like, you could do that. That's awesome. Like, well, here's my fucking people. You know what I mean? That's the people I've been missing. I didn't have them before. There they are. They're brightly colored and they're really fun and they're really interesting. I'm gonna go do that for a while, you know. And I sort of got on that bus and I never got off.
Yeah, yeah, and I don't think you should have. I think it's a great bus to be on, and I think you should welcome as many people on there.
Hmm.
With the time that we have left, and thank you so much. This is tons of fun. Um, Cornell 77, Barton Hall, the famous conspiracy theory that the concert never happened. And it's funny because my friend that introduced me to tequila and all good music, he's actually my dad's friend first, but I kind of hijacked him along the way. And he's the one that told me, because he's like, dude, if you like the Springsteen, Atlantic City's a pretty good song, but J-Rad and the band do an amazing cover of it. And you should check out. And then when I checked out J-Rad's cover, it went into I Know You Rider, and I was like, now I don't know what I'm listening to, but and that's actually what introduced me, right? And
Hmm.
yeah, it's very funny. But the first thing that he told me to listen to, he's like, dude, when you listen to the Dead, you gotta listen to the live shows. He's like, Cornell 77, that's what you start with. Okay. He's like, that's the first thing you do. And it turns out that it's this whole controversial thing. What is that? What's going on with that?
Well, first of all, let me say that my favorite Atlantic City, and I love Bruce Springsteen, by the way. I'm a big Springsteen fan. I've loved him first since I was young, and I have nothing but respect
He
for
saved my
him.
life for sure.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, no, I dig him a lot. I think he's an American treasure, no doubt about it. That said, my favorite Atlantic City is Levon Helms, um,
Oh,
and that is probably how J Rad got to it, is through
uh-huh.
Levon Helms. So check that one out if you haven't. But a lot, Cornell is what it is because so many people. It's really a great accessible way to introduce somebody to live Grateful Dead because it's got a little bit of everything that they did really well. And,
Mhm.
if you give somebody a real primal, like, 66 or 67 Dead,
Yeah.
it might be just too much. It's
Too
like
noisy, too chaotic,
too
too.
noisy, weird, chaotic. There's nothing to attach to. And so there's aspects of lots of different styles, flavors of the Grateful Dead in that one Cornell 77 show, and it's played exquisitely. Um,
Mhm.
I don't know. I understand that people say it didn't happen. I assume
Why?
that they're
Why would they
really,
say that though?
well, I assume they're just joking. I think it's just a joke. I don't think anybody actually believes it didn't happen. If they did,
Okay.
they
I've seen on the
probably got
I've
other
seen people
things
say
that they
there's no
believe.
ticket stubs around and there's no videos from that show and there's no live recordings and around that time period, like there's plenty of recordings. What's going on with that?
Yeah.
You know,
Well,
but
let
that's
me tell you that I've spoken to all the people who put on that show, and were tons of people that were at that show. And I had a great interview with Betty Cantor Jackson, who did the sound for the Grateful Dead at the show, and talked about her recording of it. And so, I mean, I guess what I would say is, like, there's an old saying, never trust a prankster. And I think that's what that story falls into. Like, people are just screwing around. You know what I mean? It's so, and I say this in Cornell 77, which you'll find, like, I don't play the like best show ever game. And I think basically what it amounts to is that's been said so many times that people just want to poke a pin in it just because it's fun to poke a pin in the big thing,
Yep.
and watch it deflate. So I think it's just a goof. I don't think anyone really believes that. Of course, Weir didn't help anyone. He went on and sort of played with that idea on an interview that he did out of TRI Studios, with big Steve Parrish, and he was sort of like, okay, now the cat's out of the bag. We're going to say it like Cornell never happened, and he, you could see it on YouTube or whatever. There's a little clip of it, and he's just having fun with that too. So I don't know. People might take that and be like, see, I totally, but I don't. I want to say, like, I don't think anybody really believes it didn't happen.
Yeah.
I
So
want to
good.
think
Okay,
that
that's
people
good to
think
know.
that.
That's good.
I think it's just a goof. But it's a great. I applaud your dad's friend, now your friend, for making that the first show that he suggested. I think it's a great entry point, and I hope that when you read the book, that will become clear why it's a great entry point, because I sort of delve into that.
Yeah, yeah. I'm going to check that out. The other ones that he recommended was the closing of Winterland 70. Is that 77 or 78? I don't,
Um, I think it's 75 or six. I don't know. It's a mid
and
70s something.
and then
Um,
my favorite that I recommend to people that I feel like if you like that is the Fillmore East one from 70, I think, 69 or 70, and it has like that 4 hour long playlist, set list. But they
Yeah.
play it's a purple cover, and it's like a purple cover. I'll send you the screenshot. It is just like everyone, I think it's 70 or 71. Everyone is in they gave Pigpen like probably a dozen songs. You know, they played Love Light, they played Hard to Handle, they played like all the Pigpen songs, they played all the weird songs, and they played all the Jerry songs, and like they just did it, and then all the fun songs at the end. They played Alligator, they played Saint Stephen, they played like like, it was just one of those nights that you could see they just and I've spoken to so many people that have hung around that scene there, and they're like, you're watching this. I'm like, do you know that history is being made? They're like, we have no idea that history is being made. We're just having the time of our lives, and like we are tripping off our butts, and like that's it, and that's what
Yeah.
it's about.
Well, if you haven't checked it out, check out the Grateful Dead movie. Is They turned the
Yeah,
closing of the Winterland into that movie, and it's really, really a cool entry point for the band, and including listening to Deadheads talk about the music and why they're there and stuff like that. And so that's a real classic that Garcia spent a ton of time working on. So it's really coming from that mind as well. I think maybe one of the shows you're talking about is Fillmore East 21370, and that's a really, really excellent show, introduction show as well. That's a little more out there, but it's got, to my thinking, a huge dark star in there, and one of my
yeah.
favorite dark stars.
This is 71, ladies and gentlemen.
Oh,
The
okay.
Grateful Dead, Fillmore East, 71.
Oh, that yes, yes, of course, sure.
Um, and my phone's are currently black and white, so I can't show you the art mode
No,
of
I
it.
have it. Somebody sent me a painting of that cover. I have it somewhere. Yeah, I do know that one.
Yeah,
Sure.
yeah, I've listened to that over and over. So, oh man, okay. In closing, I guess, and I appreciate your time. Thank you. This is a lot of fun. I I showed my high school class the song Ripple, and we did a lyrical examination of that song. And honestly, that my students interpreted it a bunch of different ways, and like, and all of them felt really true and beautiful to me. And I'm like, and they're like, which one, who's right? And I'm like, you're all right. Like that's totally the way that they would have liked that. Um, as a writer and as someone that appreciates lyrics, what are a couple of the standout songs and lyrics that you think are timeless that people could that like speaks to the human condition, that or humanity, if you could think of any off the top of your head?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's in a dark sort of way. I lately, Speedway Boogie has a lot of resonance, I think,
Mm-hmm.
because we're sort of living in times that feel a little darker and heavier. And that song came directly out of Altamont, which
Right.
is where all these, somebody was killed by Hell's Angels, and it was a really dark chapter. Some people say like Woodstock was sort of the light
Yeah.
side of this, and Altamont was the dark side, and New Speedway
Is
Boogie
the end of this
was
end of
was
the
was
summer of love,
born
right?
out of that. So it's like one way or another, this darkness has to give, and that to me really speaks to me lately. And again,
Mm-hmm.
just like any great piece of poetry or writing or whatever it might be, it is malleable enough to fit into our times. And I
Right.
think again, going back to where we started, the Grateful Dead songbook, you can't take particularly Robert Hunter, but also John Perry Barlow's lyrics out of that equation. Without those, you just
That's
have
right.
these great pieces of music, but you don't have this imagery that just like
That's
burns into
right.
your head. And I will tell you, when I first heard the song Ripple, I called up my friend who had introduced me to the Grateful Dead through this bootleg of Hershey Park in 1985. I got American Beauty, and I listened to it, and I heard the song Ripple. And you got to remember, I was a young poet and loved language. And I called him up and I said, "Why didn't you tell me about this song?" And he was like, I don't know if he had heard it or not, that we were both just kids. But I couldn't believe what I was hearing when I heard that song. I had never heard anything like that. I didn't know you could use language like that. I wasn't into poetry yet. And it just blew my mind. And I was like so hooked. Again, musically, yes, but those lyrics just I want to say, made me a writer. It made me
Yeah, yeah,
just boom. That was the missing puzzle piece for me that put everything into place. So that one, absolutely, New Speedway Boogie. But everything, there's like bits and pieces of all these different things. Um, that at, depending on what stage you're at in your life will just jump out and grab you.
uh-huh,
You know what I mean? So it might be Althea, at a different time. And I've had some relationship ups and downs and things like this. And sometimes Althea is like just what I need to hear. Um, so it just depends. But, this is great art because we can take songs that were written in 1970 or 67, whatever it is, and they still apply today just as
sure,
much, and you can interpret them. And also on a personal level, I can take a song that meant something to me when I was 16 and it means something very different now at
uh-huh.
55, but it's still speaking to me like crazy. And that's just amazing. It's amazing art.
Yeah, yeah. I feel that's a real lost form of art that was really so valuable. And I've heard so many artists interviewed and so many great musicians and writers say that when you get a record, that it had this sleeve with all the lyrics on it, and so you'd be able to just take the lyrics and follow along with it while you're playing. And I feel like that's a lot. When I first got into Dylan, I couldn't listen to his voice. Right, I got a bunch of records. Someone gave me a bunch of the records because they heard I had a record player, and then he played live at the Budokan in I think the '80s, and
Mhm.
it was the first digestible version. But I'm following the lyrics on the thing. I'm like, oh, cool, I have this here, and I'm reading them. I'm reading Mr. Tambourine Man because I was just reading the Steve Jobs biography and how that was his favorite song, and I was like, this is crazy just to dance along the diamond sky with, or to dance by the ocean with I don't remember. I don't want to kill the lyrics, but with one hand
Yeah.
waving free, silhouetted by the sea, circled by the circus sands. And I'm like, what is he saying? This is like the coolest thing I've ever heard. And
Right.
that also, in a similar way, that definitely it opens up your mind in a similar kind of way as psychedelics, where you realize that there's a possibility to use and implement language that you never ever would have thought before, and that kind of the way that you can now express yourself and be yourself is fundamentally different.
Right. And it certainly gave us Blinded by the Light as well.
Yes, that's
I mean,
right.
Springsteen will say like, where did that song come from? Well, I was completely, just besotted with Bob Dylan, and he took a rhyming dictionary down to the beach,
That's
and that's
right.
where that song came from, right? So, and I love that story because then you listen to it and you're like, oh, this is a Dylan, this is Springsteen doing Dylan in a way that he didn't ever replicate just like that, but it's so close to Dylan. So, yeah, I mean that's and there's amazing. I think about like the Avett Brothers. I really love, and I love their lyrics, and I think they're
Hmm.
really amazing lyricists and great storytellers and things like that. As a poet myself, I'm always really careful not to say lyrics are poetry because I think they're two different art forms, and I'm like kind of a snob with that stuff. So I keep them separate, but they are certainly poetic. You know what I mean? And
Yes.
so, and there's great, and as a child of the '70s, that was my experience, especially being a kid and having older brothers,
Hmm.
because yeah, you would open it up and there were all these cool pictures in there, and then all the lyrics, and I just poured over these things like that was my education too, and seeing how all these things were put together. um, I think the other thing that was really unique about that time, and that we're sort of like, we can't get that back, and I don't want to mourn for, we lost this or that. But the reality is, I didn't know what all these musicians had for breakfast and who they were dating and where they lived and who
Yeah.
and so I would look at a picture, let's say Jim Morrison, or I would look at a picture of Jerry and Apontra, whatever it might be, and I could dream anything I wanted into those characters, and they were like larger than life. These were our Greek
Hmm.
gods, and there was nothing. You sort of knew like so and so got arrested for like he pulled his dick out on stage in Miami, or he did whatever it might be. But like that's all you knew, and you didn't know every single thing and have pictures of it and people blogging. So it was like there's a lot of mystery there. And I think mystery is a really important part of the creative process. And in a way, you have to leave the mystery open so that the person experiencing the art can bring themselves into it and fill in those spaces, you know? And so I think it's harder these days for an artist to have that mystery because people don't want mystery. They want to know, they want the concrete stuff. Well, mystery is good. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It is good to be in a places of uncertainty, right?
Hmm.
You know, and John Keats, negative capability, right? The ability to be in that space of like, I don't know, but I'm okay with it and all this stuff. So that to me is a part of art. And so I like that, the mystery, and I respect artists who can sort of hold some of that back because it's harder and harder to do. But I think it's important for, you know, certain artists to have their audiences engage with their art that way and give them
Yeah.
space because it gives them ownership of it in a way that's like it's not so possessed by the artist that there's no room for me. I want
Yeah.
to have a part of it. And that's again, the Grateful Dead had a ton of space for that.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess the last thing I'll say for for this conversation is your book reminded me. I meant to say when you gave the Altamont comparison to the happier version of that book. What was the book called by Danny Sugarman, the guy that's the publicist for the Doors?
Oh
Do you know?
yeah.
You know what I'm
Yeah, I
talking
do. Yeah, I
about?
do it.
Oh my gosh, it's and I have it right here. My Someone gave it to me. Whatever. I'm gonna have to say what it is. But that book, started off with the exact same tone as your book in so many ways. And then and then the second half of the book broke my heart is about a heroin addiction. But like and then you're writing like a lot of people lost their way along the way. And I was like, yeah, like you can see that, man. That was bonkers. I was so happy that like that ended more like Woodstock ended your story. And then I think that other story ended a little bit more with Sugarman's story ended a little bit more like Altamont, unfortunately. But
Yeah,
uh,
yeah.
Peter, thank you so much for the time. Thank you so much for elaborating on this whole beautiful, wonderful, weird, and bizarre world. And I hope maybe we can do this again because this is a lot of fun, and I'm sure there's a lot of more thoughts that we could go back and forth about, especially as pertaining to the present and kind of blending it with the past and taking your experience and hopefully trying to create some hope and positivity for the future.
Let me say one thing is I'm happy to do that again with you, and maybe after you finish Cornell down the road, we can do that. I also will say to you, and this would be a very different version, but if you'd ever like me to speak to your students, not about all the drug stuff, but about
Yeah.
writing or anything like that, I'd be happy to do that as well. I really do
Sure.
enjoy teaching and working with students, and I can be very G-rated in that way as well. So anyway, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to chat with you, and I'll talk to you down the road.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the time. I appreciate it, man. Thank you.
Okay, take care. Bye.
Okay. Bye.